Harrison Blake adjusted his crisp blue dress shirt as he stepped into Rosewood Pawn and Antiques, a shop he'd never noticed despite driving past it daily for 3 years. At 45, the tech billionaire was used to having people recognize him. But the bearded man behind the counter barely looked up from the violin case he was examining. Harrison's 15-year-old daughter Sophie stood beside him, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, wearing the kind of understated elegance that came with a privileged upbringing. She had insisted on this detour to find a vintage music box for her grandmother's birthday, though Harrison suspected she was more interested in exploring somewhere her father would never normally venture. "Excuse me," Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate attention. "We're looking for antique music boxes. Something European, preferably Austrian or Swiss." The shop owner looked up from the violin, his dark eyes measuring. He was perhaps 40, with the kind of weathered hands that spoke of both manual labor and delicate craftsmanship. His work apron suggested he did more than just buy and sell. He restored the items that came through his door. "Daniel Cartwright," the man introduced himself, extending a calloused hand. "I might have what you're looking for in the back room. Give me just a moment to finish with this." Harrison glanced dismissively at the violin case. It was clearly old, the leather worn and scuffed. "Someone pawning their grandmother's fiddle?" he asked with barely concealed disdain. "Seems like people will sell anything these days." Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained even. "Actually, this belongs to one of our regular customers, Miguel Santos. He's the night janitor at your building, Mr. Blake." Harrison was momentarily surprised that Daniel knew who he was, but pressed on. "The janitor? I suppose when times get tough, luxuries are the first to go." Sophie moved closer to examine the violin, her musical training drawing her to the instrument. "Dad, this looks really old. And beautiful." "Beautiful doesn't pay the bills," Harrison replied curtly. "Though I suppose if you're working as a janitor, you probably don't have much choice but to sell whatever you can." Daniel's hands stilled on the violin case. "Mr. Blake, with respect, you might not want to make assumptions about Miguel's circumstances." "Oh, please," Harrison scoffed. "What circumstances could possibly justify a janitor owning a violin? It's clearly beyond his means. Probably inherited it and never learned to play." Sophie had been examining the instrument more closely, and something in her expression made Daniel pay attention. "Miss, do you play?" "Since I was 5, Sophie answered. Dad, this isn't just any old violin." Harrison waved dismissively. "Sophie, we're not here for a music lesson. Mr. Cartwright, about those music boxes?" But Daniel was watching Sophie's face as she studied the instrument. "What do you see?" he asked her quietly. Sophie's voice was filled with growing amazement. "The wood grain, the varnish, the way the scroll is carved. Dad, I think this might be really, really valuable." "Don't be ridiculous," Harrison said impatiently. "If it were valuable, would a janitor be pawning it?" Daniel had reached his limit with Harrison's condescension. "Mr. Blake, would you mind if your daughter played it? I think you might learn something." Before Harrison could object, Sophie had carefully lifted the violin from its case. The moment her bow touched the strings, the shop filled with the most exquisite sound Harrison had ever heard. The instrument seemed to sing with a richness and depth that made his expensive home sound system seem hollow by comparison. Sophie played a piece by Bach, her skilled fingers drawing music from the violin that seemed to transform the very air around them. When she finished, there was profound silence in the shop. "My God," Sophie whispered, cradling the violin like a precious child. "Dad, this is a masterpiece. The resonance, the tonal quality. I've never played an instrument like this." Daniel nodded solemnly. "That's because you're holding a 1923 Giuseppe Fiorini violin. It's worth approximately $200,000. Harrison's face went white. "That's impossible. A janitor doesn't own a violin worth more than most people's houses." "Miguel Santos," Daniel said quietly, "was the principal violinist for the Barcelona Symphony for 23 years. He came to America 15 years ago, hoping to join a major orchestra here. But his accent was thick, his credentials were hard to verify, and orchestra positions are incredibly competitive. He took the janitor job to support his family while he auditioned." Harrison felt the ground shifting beneath his assumptions. But surely someone with his talent, Daniel continued, has been playing for tips in subway stations on weekends, giving private lessons to children in his neighborhood for $20 an hour, and maintaining his skills by practicing in empty office buildings after hours. Sophie was still holding the violin, her eyes bright with tears. Dad, he's been playing in our building? All this time? Every night after he finishes cleaning, Daniel confirmed. Usually around midnight in the conference room on the 40th floor. He says the acoustics remind him of the concert halls he used to perform in. Harrison sat heavily in a nearby chair, the weight of his prejudice settling on his shoulders. Why is he pawning it now? Daniel's expression softened. His granddaughter was accepted to Juilliard. Full scholarship for tuition, but she needs money for living expenses in New York. Miguel would rather sell his most precious possession than let her miss this opportunity. Sophie carefully placed the violin back in its case, her movements reverent. Dad, we have to do something. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, thinking of all the times he'd walked past Miguel in the hallways, never really seeing him, never acknowledging that the man emptying his wastebasket might have once commanded standing ovations in some of Europe's finest concert halls. Mr. Cartwright, Harrison said finally, I'd like to buy this violin. It's not for sale, Daniel replied. It's collateral for a loan. Miguel has 6 months to reclaim it. Then I'll pay off his loan, Harrison said firmly. And I'll cover his granddaughter's living expenses for all 4 years at Juilliard. Sophie threw her arms around her father's neck. Really, Dad? Harrison nodded, but he wasn't finished. And I'd like to arrange something else. My company hosts a charity gala every year. This year, I'd like Miguel to be our featured performer. Daniel's stern expression cracked into the first smile Harrison had seen from him. I think Miguel would like that very much. Though I should warn you, he'll insist on earning it, not just accepting charity. Fair enough, Harrison said. Sophie, would you be interested in taking lessons from a former principal violinist? Sophie's face lit up. Could I really? I think, Harrison said, looking around the shop with new eyes, that we have a lot to learn from people we've been too blind to see. 2 months later, Harrison stood in the wings of the grand ballroom at the Meridian Hotel, watching Miguel Santos tune the very violin that had almost been lost to financial necessity. The janitor had transformed into the maestro he had always been, wearing a tailored tuxedo that Harrison had insisted on providing. Sophie waited nearby, violin in hand. Over the past weeks, Miguel had become not just her teacher, but a bridge to understanding music in ways her expensive private instructors had never shown her. Tonight she would perform a duet with him, a piece Miguel had composed himself. Mr. Blake, Miguel said quietly as they prepared to go on stage. I cannot find words to thank you, Harrison shook his head. Miguel, you've given my daughter something far more valuable than I gave you. You've taught her that true mastery comes from passion and dedication, not just privilege. As Miguel and Sophie took the stage to thunderous applause, Harrison realized that the most important lesson hadn't been his to give, but his to receive. He had learned that worth cannot be measured by job titles or bank accounts, and that sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in the most ordinary places, waiting for someone to truly see them. The music that filled the ballroom that night was more than just notes and melodies. It was the sound of assumptions crumbling, of prejudice giving way to understanding, and of two families whose lives had been forever changed by the simple act of listening, really listening to what someone else had to offer. In the audience, Daniel Cartwright smiled as he watched the performance, knowing that sometimes the most valuable things that come through his shop aren't the antiques and instruments, but the opportunities to connect human hearts across the artificial barriers that too often keep us apart.